Civil War began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The war may have started as a white man's war, but the underlying issue was 300 years of slavery. Many African Americans saw the war as a chance to take up arms to liberate themselves, their families, and their fellow slaves in bondage. The war to them was not about states' rights or secession, but about forever ending slavery. When the war began in 1862, only white men were allowed to fight for the Union Army. Many escaped slaves and people of color were willing to fight for the Union. They believed that if the North won the war, it would mean the end of slavery. They wanted to fight to show that they were just as strong, brave, and loyal as any of the other white soldiers. They were turned away because of a federal law that was made in 1792 against African Americans bearing arms for the United States Army.
Even though African Americans were declined the opportunity to enlist in the war, they still joined the Civil War efforts for the Union. Many became laborers or servants for the military. Some light-skinned African Americans were even able to enlist by claiming to be white and providing false personal information. African Americans that offered their services to the Confederate Army. Those that were on the Confederate side joined because they believed that it would be impossible to successfully rebel against their slaveholders. They worked for the Confederacy with hope that after the war they would be freed for their display of loyalty. The Southern leaders were willing to give free blacks work in the Confederate Army, but not as soldiers. With the start of the war, abolitionists were given a new hope and energy. They put out newspaper articles, pamphlets, sermons. The war was seen as the perfect time for emancipation. Many abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, believed that emancipation of all slaves was the only right outcome of the war. Getting rid of slavery in the rebel states would kill the Confederacy's main source of strength. The best possible thing the Union could do to win the war was to end the primary cause of the war, slavery.
The goals of the black abolitionists were more than just a Union victory. They wanted to have equal rights. They felt that if the Union allowed them to fight, that they would have more of a say and they would be able to prove themselves worthy. And it would also double the size of the Union Army, making the war faster and resulting in fewer white deaths.
The first Confiscation Act was passed by Congress on August 6, 1861. It allowed Union troops to seize rebels' property, including slaves who fought with or worked for the Confederate military and became contrabands of war. Around September 25th, the Navy was the first branch of the military to bring the act into use. Some of the contrabands were used to do non-combat work, which pleased the white soldiers, because they wouldn't have to do all the manual labor themselves. In 1862, large amounts of African Americans, men and women, were given work for the Union Army and Navy. They were used for jobs like building, cooking, doing laundry, and even taking care of the injured when sick in the hospitals. As time passed, the Northern public began to lose interest in the war. They thought that the war would be quick and over in a few months at the most. The Union suffered loss after loss, and the number of white men willing to fight started to decline. On July 17, 1862, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act, which freed slaves in rebellious states in the South, and authorized to employ as many persons of African descent as he may deem necessary and proper for the suppression of this rebellion, in such manner as he best for the public welfare. On the same day, Congress passed the Militia Act. This act repealed the law made back in 1792, which denied African Americans the opportunity to fight in wars.
After the Union experienced the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in any rebel states. This excluded the few slave states that stayed loyal to the Union and all the slaves in the states of regions that were already occupied by the Union forces. Lincoln included a special phrase which allowed for slaves to serve by law in the military as armed soldiers and sailors. At last, African Americans had the chance to prove their loyalty and courage through fighting, receiving the right to fight, and had bigger importance to African Americans than being able to fight in the war. They started to understand that only if they were willing to fight for their freedom, they would be treated like free citizens.
Many well-known black leaders were chosen to work as recruiting agents. Frederick Douglass was the most famous of these leaders. These leaders gave speeches and went around visiting wherever black men could be found. They would encourage black men to become soldiers by promising them an eventual citizenship. On May 22, 1863, the United States War Department established the Bureau of Colored Troops. It was created to oversee efforts to recruit African Americans throughout the nation. They were called the United States Colored Troops and were only allowed to be commanded by white officers.
The idea of African Americans fighting the war was looked down upon by many generals. They believed that they wouldn't be able to execute orders properly and that they would act like cowards when fighting. But not everyone believed this. Many welcomed the idea of them fighting.
The earliest officially recognized battle fought by the U.S. colored troops was in Louisiana on May 27, 1863. The Union Army moved against the Confederate Fort Hudson along the Mississippi River. African American soldiers advanced in the face of deadly artillery fire. The attack was a failure, but it proved the African American soldiers could fight bravely in battle. The colored troops proved themselves again on June 7, 1863, in one of the most intense battles of the war. The battle took place at Milliken's Bend in Louisiana. The Confederate troops faced a black regiment in hand-to-hand combat, and despite how outnumbered and little training that the African Americans received, they still won the battle. It made it possible for the Northern troops to capture Fort Vicksburg and gave the control of the Mississippi River to the Union. A month later, on July 18th, the 54th Massachusetts, the most famous colored regiment, fought in a battle at Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The 54th Massachusetts was the first regiment of Northern blacks that became a part of the war. They were commanded by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, son of a prominent Boston abolitionist. And among the black soldiers was Frederick Douglass's two sons, Charles and Lewis Douglass. By the time the 54th grew to 600 soldiers, Colonel Shaw volunteered the troop to carry out an important charge on Fort Wagner. The troop led the assault against the fort. The Confederacy set up large cannons and small arms fire. Half the men in the regiment, including General Shaw, were lost. Despite the large number of losses, and the troop kept going uphill and fought with courage and commitment. They lost the battle, but it is still remembered as a display of the men's bravery. By the end of the war, 18,000 African Americans served in the Army, and about 19,000 more served in the Navy for Union forces, 40,000 of which died during time of war, and 3/4 of the deaths were either of infection or disease. Racism was a prominent issue in the Union military. Any blacks enlisted in the war were put into special troops specifically designed to segregate the black soldiers from the white soldiers. Many of the African American recruits were given non-combat duties. They were rarely used for combat because they were given little opportunities to prepare for battle. When they were given the opportunity to fight in battles, though, they were at a greater risk of death because the Confederate Congress threatened to kill or sell into slavery any African American they captured while fighting in battles. And they were only allowed to serve in the lowest ranks in the military and were given poor equipment, small rations, medical care, and pay than the white soldiers. The white soldiers were given $13 a month with a $350 allowance for clothing, while a black soldier was given $7 a month with no extra pay for clothing. Many troops protested because they did not want to accept pay that was any less than what white men would receive. The 54th Massachusetts fought unpaid for an entire year, and the men in the South Carolina regiment laid down their weapons in front of their commander's tent and refused to fight until they were given an equal pay. One African American soldier wrote a letter to President Lincoln to inform him of the unfair treatment that African American soldiers had to live with. He wrote about the conditions that he and the other black soldiers had to face. He pointed out the reality in writing, "We have done a soldier's duty, why can't we have a soldier's pay? And we feel as though our country has spurned us. How are we to serve her?" On June 18, 1864, the government finally awarded African American troops an equal pay, rations, medical care, and supplies as the white soldiers. Throughout the war, the Confederate Army allowed African Americans to work as manual labor, but never as soldiers in the army, and only when they were in desperate need did they allow them to, and it was a few weeks before the war ended in March of 1865, and they offered freedom to any African American or slaves who would enlist in the army. The United States colored troops fought more than 400 engagements and made up a total of 10% of the Union forces. Some of the men had been freed, but many more had been fugitive slaves from the Confederate States. They fought for two major reasons: to help abolish slavery and to save their country. By the end of the war, more than 38,000 black soldiers had lost their lives. Their contributions were extremely important and necessary for Union victory. And because of their victory, they could look forward to the total abolition of slavery. Passed in February before Lincoln's death, Congress finalized the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery across the United States. Not long after that, in 1868, Congress proposed the 14th Amendment giving African Americans citizenship. And finally, in 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed prohibiting citizens from being denied the right to vote because of their race. After nearly 250 years, people could no longer own human beings as property. The war brought the most important change to the lives of African Americans. It ended slavery and gave them the chance to prove themselves through their courage and abilities. The war never ended racism, and it never secured African Americans a true equal position in society. The rights that they never received weren't provided to them until after the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s. The fight for true freedom was a fight for years, and the battle for colorblind equality is still present to this day.